Today's interview is with Erik Huddleston, who is the assistant performance coach for the Indiana Pacers, as well as the head performance coach for their G League affiliate, the Fort Wayne Mad Ants. I hope you guys enjoyed today's conversation.
There is a individualized position within our organization for everything. Everything that you could ask for, we've got, right? So it's difficult when, and luckily we do a good job with communication between these departments because we're all kind of, it's support staff. We are all working together in support of the athlete. But when I've got a plan to do a lift with a guy that takes 40 minutes in a day, and they've got a 35-minute treatment, and they've got a massage lined up, and they've also, their skills and development coach wants to get them in for shooting. When you look at how that adds up across the day, it's not 1 or 2 hours in the gym and they're gone. This is
No, it's
a
like 6 hours.
5, 6, 7, 8 hour day for them. And then,
Mhm.
it's dietary consultants, it's family stuff outside of that. There's so many factors of this that are just like, it is not quite. Sometimes I have to think like, man, these guys are getting paid to play a game, and then I have to realize all of the things that go around that for them. And it's not just getting paid to play a game. There are so many things that they're dealing with. um, and it really puts it into perspective once you get in situations like this. Like, we are gone all the time. There are sacrifices that they have had to make, to be in the position that they're in, and then they're getting pulled different ways by family and different ways by staff. And so um, it's been very, very eye-opening, I guess, coming from the private side, like you said, and being able to kind of see some of this stuff and how it pieces together for a guy in season, because it's so much different than what you imagine it is.
Yeah, and I'd imagine it's markedly different from coming from Indiana University as well. When you're a collegiate student or a college student, you're worried about school, romantic interest, and video games.
Yeah.
That's about it.
And
So,
there are caps laid out by the NCAA on how often you can be in contact with them. There's no caps like that. So it's a tough balancing act even for me, because I will have guys, and we can get into this a little bit more in the weeds later, but it's like, now the timing of our training becomes really, really interesting, because I have to be conservative with stacking days in a way that gives them a stressor, and kind of using that day wisely, and then gives them a recovery day. And so how do we plan that out? And then how am I asking them? The timing of those things becomes really, really important. And so, yeah, I don't know. Now, if a guy asks me on an off day to come in for a lift, I'm more hesitant of coming in on a day that is, in my mind, a planned day of recovery for you, but I still want to be available for the athlete. That's a very, very difficult situation to be in, because, and now there are creative ways to get around that, right? Like, I can start to be, and uh, OKC talks about this a lot in terms of, the way that they plan training. But there's this kind of mindset of training in, so training towards the player's strengths, and there's a mindset of training away, and how you do that formats a little bit of the recovery side of things going forward. If you train away from their strengths, they're generally going to be more sore, and so that takes a little bit more from a fatigue standpoint. But then, training away, training in takes a little bit less of those resources from them. So you can be creative in the ways that you set that stuff up, more input driven or more output driven. But it is still, I struggle with the ego still of feeling like I'm being of value to them on days when they ask me to come in, and I think that we should probably not. And how do you appease them, and how do you still, continue to make progress or allow them to recover? It's really, really difficult.
yeah, I find that to be one of the hardest things to balance, because what we also don't realize is for them to go in on an off day is psychologically good for them. For some players, as in they just want to go, they know the court is their safe haven. They can go and forget about everything, block out family noise, agents, endorsements, all that stuff, and they can focus kind of on their craft, and they find a lot of peace in that. And that is an outlet for them, right? So it's kind of weird because we look at it from a load management perspective and we say, hey, you really need to do time on feet. You need to be off your feet today. It's really important that you're off your feet. But then if they say, hey, coach, I just need to come in and get some shots up, I'll be 30 minutes. You almost have to balance like, okay, I know he really should be off his feet today, but how much is it gonna hurt him? And then you kind of go into what you were saying, like the ins and outs. It's like, all right, well, if he really just comes in and he gets 100 shots and he's on his feet for no more than 25 minutes, I can live with that. And I think at the highest levels, like where you're at, it's a lot about compromising and kind of meeting the player where it's at. And the other difficulty is that this grind mentality is what got a lot of these players to that level. And now we're trying to tell them, hey, actually, you could perform better if you rested a little bit more. And that is just very counterintuitive to everything they have believed their entire career.
Right. I think that, and you make a really great point about the grinded out type of mentality that this we have a culture of that exists in players that get to this level. I think where we've had success with that recently, though, is the fact that our rookies now, if they've played 2 years of college basketball, those seasons have been incredibly short due to COVID. So, you look at some of the guys that we have in now that are younger, they've had college seasons that consisted of maybe 20 games, in the span of 2 years. So they've played, essentially where we're at right now in our season halfway. They've played that amount of games in 2 years.
That's crazy.
That is a very different, that puts it into perspective for them, understanding that this schedule is not a joke. It is not designed for you to go 100 miles an hour 24/7. It can't be, because this is it's funny sometimes, just based on how many games that we play and how many back-to-backs it is, and how many how much road travel there is. It's funny to me how much of a game within a game that is, because then you look at the rules of on load management now, how you sit stars, how you where that came about from a coaching standpoint was really, really smart, because you can kind of look at trends in the data and be able to say, look, like so and so is going to have a breakdown every fourth game of when we play 4 out of 7.
Yeah.
So that becomes a marker essentially to sit somebody and allow them that rest period, and not use that game if it's a game that we can afford to not have them play in, to not use that game. But then the league still comes up with rules to prevent you from doing that kind of thing. And it's not necessarily at the player's best interest. I think that it is at the best interest of the league to have their stars available to play national televised games or to sell out fan bases. But it makes it very, very difficult to circumnavigate all of those avenues, and how do we preserve players' availability and the readiness at the end of the day. And it again, we've got a wealth of resources. There's never been more money in the league than there is right now. But what are the trends that we're seeing? It's still not, we're not the healthiest we've ever been.
Well, because a lot of it it's an organizational thing, right? Teams don't want to be left behind by what other teams are doing. So they are copying the models that other teams are doing, or the resources or recovery modalities that other teams are using, but they're not per se enhancing their perspective on recovery or load management. It's just we are measuring it more.
Right.
And that's not true for all teams. Of course, there's plenty of teams that do a great job with that. I'm just kind of speaking. It is difficult in the professional organizations. Like a GM, a head coach doesn't understand the physical. He doesn't, from a sports science or strength and conditioning perspective, doesn't really understand the demands. He understands because maybe he played basketball and he understands the general amount of load, but he doesn't really understand all that stuff that you guys are looking at on the back end. Yet he's the one who's almost deciding how practice is looking, which drills are happening, and all those things. And management is also deciding on which items are approved to be purchased or not.
Right. And to piggyback off your point there too, it's that's why it's so important to have a really, really quality, high level medical staff with where you're at, because of the point you just made. The people who are in executive decisions have played basketball, so they understand kind of that world. They've worked out before, so they, at least on the surface level, understand what I do, or they've physically gone through training before, so they think that they have a better grasp of what I do, than maybe the average person. But from a medical standpoint, they've never been in that field, and so when someone in a sports medicine team makes a recommendation, those things are listened to really, really attentively by executives. And so,
Mm.
if you've got people in place that are able to make informed decisions across the board from a medical standpoint, those are going to be important people to have your back as a performance coach in this field, because they ultimately are who is going to be kind of lifted on the pedestal of importance from a organizational standpoint here. And so having sometimes they're uncomfortable conversations, but having those conversations are important to be able for them to see where you're coming from you to see you to be able to see where they're coming from, and then for management to be able to have a message relayed that's going to be impactful.
Now you're navigating politics. That comes with its own set of
And tell me
issues
about
and things that we are not going to discuss on this podcast because that is not appropriate to be out there. I've heard you talk on previous podcasts about how you have your own way of assessing players, whether it's a table test and then a counter movement jump on force plates. What were some maybe general themes that you saw throughout the players, or observations that you saw through your assessment?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think that the majority of times in the college setting, especially, it becomes very, I think the general public will understand the term like combine driven. I think for us in like the performance world, it's the testing that we do at the college level is generally really output oriented. It's how high can you jump? How much can you do of this? And because at that level you're essentially molding clay. I remember my year at Indiana University, I think out of the freshmen that we had on the team, which I think there were 4 freshmen at the time, 3 of them had never been in a lifting program before. They had never worked out like that.
Wow.
They'd obviously had on-court stuff, and we're talking about a really, really high level of Division I college basketball, and players had no weight room experience. And so you set those parameters for them at that level to say, okay, these are the things that we need to get better on because these are the outputs that you're giving us so far. And I think that as I've learned over the years now, I've able to kind of how I've been able to form my own assessment process. It's much more, how much control over position do you have? How much access to range of motion do you have? Passive and active. How obviously the outputs are still important. There are things from a performance standpoint. It's my job title. I am a performance coach. So at the end of the day, it is a output driven title. But like we said before we were recording, it's the inputs and the player availability that really is kind of becoming king in this industry,
Mm-hmm.
and making sure that assets are available to be on the court. That's what teams are most worried about when it comes to a position like this. So the assessment process has, I would say, just continuously evolved. It is still very, for me at least, very table test oriented, because that is how that is for me the quickest and my most efficient way of measuring what an athlete can do. It tells me immediately where their hips are going to go on a squat. It tells me what their push-up is going to look like. It tells me, it gives me, without having them, use a lot of time, because time is obviously a very important resource where we're at.
Right.
It allows me to figure out a more global picture of them for me in a much more brief period of time. obviously that's where we identify asymmetries, and not necessarily just the asymmetries themselves, because we obviously know that those exist for everybody, but the degree of those asymmetries. And so that sets up for me at least mentally, a program at the time of what we're going to need to address. So a hierarchy of needs. And then obviously the performance-based tests are, like you said, it's in this setting, a counter movement jump tells me a lot, because it's acceleration, it's deceleration, it's force production, it's force acceptance, it's this wider range of things that from an outsider it just looks like a jump, and for me it's change of direction and sprinting and all of this other kind of multifactorial athletic qualities. You can make correlations to that counter movement jump. So
Right. And you talk about how there's different archetypes and body shapes, whether it's like a wide ISA or a narrow ISA. Is there any pattern that you've observed with your team that generally, or observations at least from a positional perspective, like you saw guards, like guards generally tend to have X on your team
yeah,
or your
yeah.
G League team?
Across the spectrum, the majority of the athletes that I measure are at this level are narrow ISA individuals. How they compensate over that really varies. Obviously, genetics play a huge kind of component of that. So you have guys that from a base archetype, a narrow ISA is not typically someone who's good at force production, but obviously through sport and through training, these are freaks at force production by the time that they're seeing me. And so how did they become that is this really interesting pathway from an athletic standpoint. How did they add layers of muscle on to help compress, because typically narrow ISA individuals aren't good at compression. What are the compensations in their jump? So not only are we looking at the force plate numbers, which paints this non-visual representation of what's going on, but we're taking video and we're observing what they're doing. You're watching their movements in the weight room and on the court, and so you start to figure out what their strategy is to get things done, and then you address those things. If they're a non-issue, they're a non-issue. If they're not something, and so many of these players now, by the time they get to me, have had some kind of soft tissue injury prior to even entering the league. It's right. A pretty prevalent thing at this point. And so what's their background? What is the way that they are managing those stresses? How are they creating outputs? And then how do we balance that in terms of, again, it's another kind of hierarchy of things. What do we address first? And then what are your strategies for addressing those things? So, most of the athletes that I measure on the table are limited in hip internal rotation, usually on one side more than the other. And it's not necessarily, this doesn't align always, but typically I'll see left side internal rotation. The majority of our leagues right-handed and they're left foot jumpers. And so when you take that and dial it back, I think a lot of people in our position would say, okay, we need to drive internal rotation on their left side because it's so limited. And my mindset is they're already in internal rotation on that left side. So what am I doing to bring back a more full excursion between ER and IR on that left side? And so that's where ER allows for that movement. So my strategy for addressing something like that is typically opposite of I think what a lot of the industry would do, because I'm not taking them further into the pattern that I believe that they're already in. I'm trying to create movement outside of that window.
You're trying to expand their ability to expand the range, basically,
right.
of that movement.
Their field of movement options on that left side, and I'm just using left as an example, is so limited now that they're showing a decreased full excursion of hip movement on that side. So my objective by increasing or by directing things towards an ER field is to open that window. So now we have, because again, it's not all. What's so tricky about the wording of ER and IR is that if you're moving in the direction of one, that's ER. So
Mhm.
I can have a knee position that looks to me like IR, but if I am moving in the direction of ER, it's ER. And if
Mhm.
I'm moving in the direction of IR, it's IR. It's not, there's not this gray line down the middle that says once you're on this side, it's ER, and once you're on this side, it's IR. It's a window of movement availability. So being able to have that be more open. Now I'm not looking for textbook definitions of that, right? Because again, that's a these are a different breed of human being
Right.
that's being able to create force like they do. So I'm not looking to create this textbook definition of full excursion, but I am looking to increase their availability to a point that's I think going to be beneficial for them.
Yeah, and this brings up an interesting topic because with today's rise in technology of force plates and other devices that measure things, from a biomechanical perspective, everyone is kind of looking to reduce asymmetries, right? Or within range. But something that you mentioned that, and I've been thinking about is, well, their asymmetries are what allow them to do what they're best at. Is it in my best interest? Like if this guy's best asset is this move or this movement pattern, and he's been grooving it, and he's coming to me when he's 27 years old, and he's only here with me for, I don't know, 1 or 2 years, am I trying to come up with different strategies to maybe limit the asymmetries but also enhance his current strategy?
Right. I think that there are really two ways to look at that. I think that, and I don't know how I think the way that you bucket this is really, really, really individualized based on who you're working with. There are some guys that I think are so low force output that the compensation that they're going through is not an issue for me. And in fact, if you take away their ability to compensate, you're probably going to make them an even worse athlete than they already are. I think on the other end of that, there are some guys who are just such freaks and they don't manage those forces back into the ground well, that reducing some level of their compensation, if it allows them to, if you've got a guy that has a 46-inch vertical jump, and
Mhm.
you take away 2 inches of that vertical jump by allowing them some extra um, force absorption quality, is it necessarily making them a worse athlete? Like I don't see it like that. So I think that there are some people that you can afford to let them lean into their compensation. I think there are some people that you need to dial it back with, and I think that how you choose that and how like the strategies to go about something like that are
Mhm.
so situationally driven. Um, and again, like you said, we've got we're looking at now development plans for rookies that are going to be with this organization for 4 years.
Right.
We should at least have a very, very clear plan about where those people are going and where like what are our steps at least this is something that continuously should be evolving, but what are our steps to achieve those goals?
Mhm.
On the other end of that, you have some organizational requirements with guys who are maybe only on 1 or 2 year contracts, and for them, at least within the confines of our organization and our facility, you have to be a little bit more lenient with what you're going to be able to get away with and what you're not going to be able to get away with, and it shouldn't be at the risk of the athlete. Obviously, like we still want to help them achieve their goals. Our we want to win, and they want to win also, but we also want them to be healthy in the long term, and so balancing those becomes difficult because um, sometimes you have to balance those things in a way that's not really optimal for either group, and that's difficult.
Right. So to summarize what you are saying in layman terms, so everyone knows what you're really saying, is that management or coaching staff might want player to do X. That might, in terms of his athletic development, might not be the best priority for him, but the team needs him to perform or do or jump in a certain way now. So we need to figure out, we don't want to injure him. We obviously want him to stay healthy, but also drive that adaptation or that quality that's required on the court.
Very well said. Yeah, I mean, that's essentially it. I have really two separate entities that I work with, and their goals aren't always aligned. And they shouldn't be, honestly, because the player needs to look out for themselves, and with the team goal in mind, and really from an organizational standpoint, there is only the team goal. There is not an individual need.
Right.
And so balancing those two things as a support staff member is challenging, but like you said, it is something that we are trying to benefit both parties without detriment to either.
Now that you're with a professional organization, you spend a ton of time at practice and at games. Can you take us maybe through some scenarios where you've made an observation with a player? Walk us through maybe the analytical framework that you use, and then maybe the tactical applicable things that you maybe did in a weight room to drive an adaptation that you wanted to see on the court.
Right. Okay, so let's start kind of in a linear time frame on this. So the first thing a player does before a game, when they have their court time with a skills coach, is they come out and see me for activation. So activation is typically something that is going to feed into their skill set. It's going to ramp them up. It should be very kind of sympathetically driven. It is designed to increase their stress level and prepare their tissues for competition. So at the end of the day, from stuff that you would see on my Instagram that is very, very input driven, this is not that stuff. This is very output driven. There's a lot of rhythm. There's a lot of plyometric looking, force output driven things that we do during that activation to prepare them for what they're about to do on the court. Now it scales in a very upward trend, obviously. Like, we don't start them out doing the hardest thing. You start them out doing kind of the lowest hanging fruit, things that are easily achieved positions for them, and then ramping those patterns up to the point where we're working into a sweat and getting them on the court. After that, they go into their on-court stuff. So that's where you can start to see what you've done from a movement standpoint in that activation start to transfer to the court. The thing that I would argue when I'm watching them do their skills stuff in any situation really is that it's not full speed.
Right.
It's on air every time, so they're not being guarded by anybody. It's mostly set shots. I would say they're probably going 50 to 75% on most of this stuff, because it's a routine. It's for them to get into a routine. And so I don't put a lot of value on what I'm seeing at that point, because again, it's not the highest level of where they're going to be performing at. When you watch a game though, you start to see all of the things that you've tried to focus on and tried to work on in the weight room break down. And they should, right? Like the things that I'm doing in the weight room are, or in our speed agility sessions, whatever it may be, those things are designed for them to make mistakes, so that eventually those mistakes are made less and less when decision making is so sporadic. The ideal is for everybody to be in this flow state where everything comes very naturally to them in sport. The reality of that is that it happens for very few individuals, I think, especially when they are trying so hard to do so well. So I see that a lot in the G League, obviously, with players that are trying to do everything the right way, and are maybe not just as naturally gifted at basketball as maybe the guys that I'm seeing at the higher level. And so
are you speaking more from a movement perspective or like
everything,
playing perspective?
Both. I think that there are just some guys when you watch watch a high level practice, there are guys that move so effortlessly. Like I think about Justin Holiday, who's now with the Sacramento Kings. That's a guy that I don't think I saw really break a sweat during practice ever. And he's a vet. He is very movement savvy. He's very comfortable with the basketball in his hands. And you'd watch guys guard him, especially during training camp when there's a lot of guys trying to prove themselves and they are busting their ass and not being able to keep up with him. And so that exists far fewer. That's much more rare at the G League level.
Right.
We have some guys who have played in the NBA and done really well, but like they have breakdowns and the majority of guys are, again, they're uncomfortable in the situation that they're in. They're trying really hard, and so sometimes the wheels get spinning and they're not quite ready to be going that speed yet. So it's different. And that again, like I said, that's on a movement side and a basketball side.
Yeah, and some of those vets that you talked about in the G League, when we look at your model of being able to accept force, produce force quickly and repeatedly, usually that repeatedly aspect is where they struggle with, whether it's because of training age or injuries or whatnot. They have those spurts, but how often can they repeat it? And that's kind of the question. That's in certain ways why they're in the G League, is because teams want to know if they can repeat it or not, or
Right.
whether they can last the season or not.
Right.
Can you take us maybe through a specific incident or like a situation though, like with one thing that you've observed maybe in the last 2 weeks, and then where your mind is going as to, okay, my next session with this guy or this week, I am going to try to execute on this with him, either
Yeah.
on the court or in the weight room.
Yeah. So we'll stem back to the table test as a starting point, because again, I've got guys that, and I can think of one in particular at the beginning of the season who was really struggling with some left knee tendonitis stuff. We do measurements on the table. They've had a history of this throughout college. Played professionally for a couple of years now, and so we're at a time frame for me when I have to assume that like the cycle of stress and kind of relaxation throughout the season, that's been adapted to at this point, when you've got a guy who's been here a couple of years. And so when you're looking at that going forward, it's what have they done in the past, and what are we doing now to kind of change that? And so you look at someone with left knee tendonitis, kind of chronic, and it flares up and it goes away based on the game cycle. And so in games, we'll avoid using left leg to stop and to start, and to really, when you look at it in a slow motion type of clip, it's avoiding landing on it. There's a lot of avoidance, and I don't think it's conscious avoidance most of the time. And so when you get into a session, it's finding a comfortable range for them with their left leg out in front of them in a split squat, learning how to find a heel to shift their center of mass back, so that hopefully when the tissue becomes accustomed to new positions and new stressors, when they do it at a higher speed, there's less of a negative response for them from a neurological standpoint. There's no pain response associated with the position, so you have to get them used to those positions. That's where you look at some of the tendon protocol stuff that Keith Barr and who's the female that does that stuff? Jill, yes. When they put that stuff out, when you read through what the protocol actually entails, it's holding at a position that it basically induces pain. Right. That's the depth of your isometric hold, is a position that induces pain. That gets them comfortable in those positions. That allows them to kind of down regulate that nervous system response that has fear associated with it and pain associated with it, and a decreased performance output associated with it. So it could be as simple as, for this athlete, and this is exactly what we did, is we kind of ramp up to that tendon protocol. So that becomes part of their warm up and their lift day. That becomes part of their on-court activation before the game. And we obviously sprinkle in some variation of that. It's not the same 45 seconds on, 2 minutes off with a certain amount of load every time, but how we do that. So for me, and hopefully none of my athletes listen to this, but it becomes tricking them into holding those positions. So with this athlete, we can do that ISO hold, then we go over the wall and we can do a split stance med ball chest pass. So again, they're holding that position. We can do a dumbbell curl in those positions. We can, the way that you layer in those things is kind of the fun of being creative as a coach.
Sneaking it in.
Yes. And that's exactly what it is. It's more time under tension in those positions. And so
Yeah.
they become more accustomed to being in that position. They're more comfortable with it. And then you watch as that develops back onto the court. And now they're using that. And because the subconscious response to avoid that is reduced, we've got guys, jumping off their left leg for the first time, or being able to stop and push off that side, because we're at the point in the season where the scouting reports become really predictable, because guys are now, there's no secrets at this point. We've played
There's
half
plenty
of
of
our
tape.
yeah, we played half our games. There's plenty of tape, and guys are going to do in a game what they are most comfortable with doing.
Yeah.
They're not taking those risks. And so now you've got some guys who are able to push off in a different direction. They're driving a way that they hadn't driven before. And so that's fun for me to see as a coach in those situations.
I guess in your lens with basketball players, what have you seen? And obviously it's very context dependent, player dependent, like that makes the biggest difference in driving maybe long-term adaptation, right? Because when I think of, a player like Jeremy, who's a little bit older, maybe getting him to jump explosively off his right leg to his left, which is, much more foreign to him because he's, right-handed, like it to me, it would take a lot longer than it sounded like you were able to make those, adaptations pretty quickly, but.
Yeah. And again, that's so context dependent based on the relationship you have with the athlete that you're working with, if they've had a positive, because so much of this is test and retest, and it's a lot of very educated guessing on my end, because you don't know what's going to work with somebody, you don't know what's not going to work with somebody. And so if you have a session that for them has a negative response to it in terms of pain level, or in terms of the expectation of what they were going to get out of that session versus what they got, it can have some setback to it. But to get back to like the root of your question, the breathing thing for me is one of the most easily manipulated variables in terms of training. If I put a heavy load on somebody and they hold their breath, that is a strategy that is going to increase their sympathetic response to that exercise, which intuitively has a negative stress response to it, right? That is the output immediately, because you are forcing them to choose this fight or flight response. They are in panic mode, and they are forced to overcome something that is generally for basketball players an uncomfortable situation for them. So by teaching them how to self-regulate something like that, to drive an input or drive an output is important. The reason that the Valsalva maneuver is used with powerlifters is to create stability.
Right.
It is to avoid, how do I say this well? Valsalva is designed to reduce variability in your system while you've got stressor, right?
A high load.
Yeah. All that Valsalva is a exhale against a closed glottis. You're bearing down on your own thorax, essentially. So it's an exhale strategy. And so that's typically associated with compression in general. And so if you've got somebody who is constantly stuck in that pattern, they usually are going to be stressed, output driven creatures. So balancing that with breathing and an exercise becomes important for some people, and for other people, I'm going to let them do what they're going to do.
Yeah, that definitely makes a lot of sense. Just to pivot a little bit, I'm interested in how you coordinate with skill development coaches. How do you communicate with them, and then how do you reinforce it in their just skill development, or is that just sometimes too idealistic?
It is it is not too idealistic. I think that in this environment, you need to be able to have those conversations. I think that there is still a lot of work that we can be doing in terms of getting those two sides to see each other's point of view a little bit better. I think that on our end, that's my job to be able to communicate those skills in a way that's going to be transferable to basketball.
Mhm.
And on their end, I need to be able to, I think that if you come into this situation without understanding kind of the demands of basketball and kind of the team environment and what's expected of each player, that can be difficult. Um, I might have an ideal that I'm looking at in terms of movement quality, that player is realistically, based on the offense that we run or the defensive sets that we run or their minutes played, are never going to achieve. And so is it necessary for me to spend time doing something like that when I can have a conversation with a skills coach that tells me, um, you know, we worked on X, Y, and Z today. I wasn't happy with the way that they were. Like, we do a lot of finishing stuff. So, you know, right finish. So jumping off your right foot, right hand finish, you know, right, left finishes. I wasn't happy with the way that this looked. And so what can we do to kind of, I think that that's going to be an important part of their game moving forward, or an important part of their development. So what can we do to make that better? That's really a conversation that needs to happen between everybody who sees that player. That's not just performance coach and skill or development coach. That's, you know, the physical therapist that works with them. There needs to be those conversations from a cohort standpoint that
Mhm.
happens so that everybody's on the same page. Because the worst thing that we could do for the athlete that we're working with is have conflicting goals for what they're going to be doing with us. Um, and so, yeah, that's a really easy conversation to have. That's a conversation that I think that we still need to, you know, I only speak for our organization. I still think we need to have more of those conversations.
Mhm.
It's difficult at the G League level. We have an entire team right now of players who have never played with us before. So this
Yeah.
is their first year with our organization. In total, so I was just talking to our general manager the other day. In total, we have had 27 players play for this team this year. That's
Wow.
call up, that's assignment players, that's you know, guys who have come in on 10 days for injury, that's COVID related stuff. 27 guys, and we're halfway through the season, on a roster that holds 10 and two ways. That's
That's
insane. That's a
insane.
lot of
Yeah.
people.
Yeah.
And so,
And they're just trying to make it.
yes,
So let alone try to buy into your system, buy into your protocols and whatnot. Like you said, players generally at the highest levels are trained, or it's in their best interest to look after their own interests, and not rely on a team to look out for their best interests, because
yeah.
the guys who bounce around from team to team are given the the same talk.
Right. I mean,
So
when players are coming in at this point in the season too, I have such little time with them because of the way that our schedule breaks down, because of the way that, like, we don't have practices at this point in the year. There's no time for that kind of thing. And also we're, you know, we're dealing with players who are on court a lot already. And so we have walkthroughs in terms of, you know, concepts that we want to work on the court, but there's not time for practices. So you've got players that are jumping into game minutes based
mhm.
on roster availability who haven't had practices or anything like that. So it's really it's a really interesting kind of challenges to navigate, because it's so counter to what the ideal is, like so far on the other end of what this should be. Um, but that's part of what makes the job fun, is being able to you know, meet those, or at least try to problem solve the best that you can.
Be adaptable and flexible within these crazy constraints, basically.
Yeah, yeah.
In going back to the example that you used of someone who's struggling to finish, what would that conversation or maybe that weight room session look like for you?
Yeah,
So
so
you don't have to give us the name of any players, but like whatever hypothetical example you want to use.
so you have to profile out kind of what type of athlete that person is to begin with. And so, what that typically looks like for me in a really generalist view is, are they high force output, or are they um, more are they more overcome by gravity at the end of the day? So are they someone who is low force output, really kind of malleable and easily overwhelmed, or are they someone who is typically leaving the ground, or driving through somebody?
Mm-hmm.
A lot of that we can figure out on the force plate. So a lot of that is based on, especially when you look at the eccentric component of the counter movement jump. Do they have a heavy percentage bias towards the braking phase, so that has concentric muscle activity, or do they have a heavy bias towards the unweighting phase, which is basically the ability to let gravity do its job?
Mm-hmm.
So where they kind of lie on that is going to tell me how we need to address the problem that we're seeing on the court. So if they're not finishing, is it a problem with over pushing, or is it a problem with not being able to push in the first place? Does that make sense?
Yes. So you're going to have the issue with some people who can't just are poor at producing force. So they're having a hard time actually getting to the basket.
Right.
And then you might have someone who can produce force, but maybe coordination or control is the bigger issue with them.
Or maybe their ability to continuously create a high level of force output as well, right? Like they produce so much force, but they're so the ceiling is high, but the basement is also up there pretty close. So how do you, based on where they end up with that, and the specific athlete that I mentioned earlier tends to be more on the low force production side than anything. And so for me, that becomes a more traditional strength and conditioning type program that is output driven, because they lack a lot of that. So not only
Trap
is
bar deadlift,
right
squatting with them,
and how you set those up becomes really individualized too. So it's not for me about long overdrawn efforts at a high level of force. It's about how much force can they produce in as little amount of time as possible, because again, the time constraint in sport is really, really important.
right?
If it takes a guy
5 minutes to do the deadlift,
right, versus just being able to get a maximal load up as quickly as possible, that to me is the difference between a good athlete and a poor athlete. And so it's going to be much more finding a good weight range to be at that they can move with speed. So you look at like a VBT type model, and we have gym aware access at our gym, and a 1080 motion also. And so you can set those ranges and those parameters and let the accommodating resistance do what it does. And that's also a really good, readiness test at the same time, because you can look at numbers from previous sessions, being able to tell, they're moving the bar at the same speed, but this is a 20% less load than it was last time. So obviously, like, their preparedness isn't quite as high as it was the last time that we did this exercise. And
right.
that's an easy way to look at it, but the way that you prescribe that stuff and the way that they perceive that output is really, really important too.
And then with the individual who has high force production, how do you approach him?
Typically, they need more of that they trend towards needing more of that accept force spectrum. If you look at the eccentric portion of the counter movement jump, the unweighting phase, which is relaxation, and the braking phase need to cancel each other out. And so if they're really, really heavy on the braking end, they need to learn how to basically decompress. And so that becomes a lot of falling stuff, a lot of dropping stuff, a lot of rolling stuff. So whether it's oscillatory isometrics where they're dropping and catching a weight, so they actually have to beat it down. The way that we use a flywheel becomes different. So, everybody, I think, probably knows what a K-box is, or, what some of the flywheel pulley stuff is now. I think it's used really often in a way that intuitively makes sense, but when you actually look at the practice of it, doesn't actually make sense, because it's pulling you to the bottom. You're not actually having to beat it to the bottom.
Right.
And so you're actually pushing earlier by using something that is eccentric overload. So the way that you prescribe a K-box exercise is beat it down. Like, you actually have to beat the flywheel to the bottom, and that helps with some of that allowing gravity to finally do its job by relaxing enough to let it do that. And so that's more of the end that I go to with those athletes.
Right. No, that makes a lot of sense with the K box too. It's a very nuanced device, and if not used properly, you're not driving the adaptation like you said. Like if people are just kind of going up at a more casual pace, like you're not going to have that same thing. Whereas when you drive up as hard as you can, you try to beat it down there and stop it and accept force there.
Sure.
Um, can you maybe discuss the nuances between in your model? It's, you know, accept force is the baseline, is the bottom of the pyramid, right? Can you maybe explain that concept? Whereas in I would feel that the person who had to produce force, like it would be a prerequisite that he would be really good at accepting force.
When you look at the table test, if they're limited in IR, they're most likely already in IR. And when you're seeing a drop off, um, when you're seeing a drop off in force production like that, you have to kind of dial back what your thought process is with something like that. It's not necessarily that they're not capable of producing more force, but could it be more efficient if you gave them the stuff that they didn't already have? Like these two things are so dependent on one another. Accepting force
Mhm.
and creating force are is this kind of really beautiful relationship between both of them helping one another.
Mhm.
And so when you don't have, or when you're feeling like you're capped in one area, it's probably because you're lacking in another. And that shows, like I've said, through the data points when we look at the counter movement jump. Um, so the baseline, like you said, for me is their ability to accept force. That is still in itself not a black and white answer. So for some people, that is their ability to accept force and limit their own descent. So their ability to hit the ground, if we're talking about like a landing from a jump, their ability to land on the ground and limit how far they go down. So that's accepting force by finding where their baseline is. So being able to stop themselves and not become over soft. That's that person that's a low force producer generally.
Mhm.
And then there's the person that needs to be able to find a landing quality and not be so rigid that they stick on the ground and they're standing straight up. And so even that quality across itself is dependent on where their starting position is. Are they able to accept force well? And that takes context from both of those sides. And then their ability to produce force and produce force quickly and produce force quickly repeatedly is much more based on where they're starting on that spectrum at the bottom. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I see. I guess where my mind started to go with this, while not related so much to force production, is in your feed, you kind of posted this one clip of Devin Booker with a up fake hesitation and then repositioning. I believe it was his left foot to help with a more horizontal vector of creating force. I know that you tend to train a lot of the different stages of propulsion, right? Whether
Yeah.
you're biasing a late stage of propulsion with the foot or whatnot. How do you, I guess, think about it in relation to, okay, you saw Devin Booker and you saw like maybe how he, instead of transferring, he just completely repositions the foot.
Right. I think that so the more output driven your training and your sport becomes, the more forward oriented you are in general. Like sports are played going in a mostly linear fashion. So
At
um,
least offenses.
right, right. And so the more forward you're driven, the more your center of mass moves over your foot. And so for athletes, a lot of times they get in these positions and now they live their life in that forward orientation. There are degrees of that, like you said. So let me define some stuff first for like people that are listening. So
And for me.
really propulsion is going to kind of be marked by counter nutation of the sacrum. So a sacrum that is really upright facing. It's going to have a vertical shin angle, and center of mass is going to be behind the foot. So this is, if you're looking at gait, this is someone stepping out with the foot and their heel has made contact on the front foot. So the leg is out in front of them, their center of mass is behind, they're generally upright.
Mhm.
Middle propulsion is going to be their center of mass above that foot. Um, so now we're directly on top. We're starting to push through the ground at that stage. Max propulsion is when that heel, so the calcaneus, actually breaks the ground, and that's the position of max force output. That's essentially an amortization phase between eccentric and concentric force production. And then you have late propulsion, which is center of mass ahead of the foot, a very steep shin angle, and there's a lot of forward orientation as athletes. So athletes in general will live someplace in that forward orientation, so middle or late propulsive position usually. When you become accustomed to that as your position for force production, it eventually is going to be self-limiting, because if you're already in a position of force production just to move around on Earth, when you actually need to be productive and be propulsive, your ability to do that and to tap in that position is limited, because your scope of
You're already at the extreme almost.
you're already used all your resources just to stand up and to walk around, and so now you're living in that forward position. You don't have anything less to go. That's where, to answer your last question and to kind of tie it into this one, that's where giving them a wider scope is going to be more effective. You give them some of the force acceptance qualities, so now they have a more well-rounded and whole ability to tap into the force production at the other end of this. You've given them a full excursion to go through. So now there's momentum that's added to that. Now there is transfer of energy from the ground to you, and using that in an effective and efficient way. So for Devin Booker in the clip that you mentioned, a lot of athletes would have difficulty pushing out of a position that his foot was originally in. It was in a late propulsive position to push out of. That gives him a very small window or a very small runway of force production after that. What he's done by repositioning his foot is given himself a full runway of force production. Now he has to be able to use that quickly, right? That's the conversation that we had earlier about long duration, high load strength training, is that it creates a long runway for force production, but it also takes an incredibly long amount of time when you're looking at the relative time of athletics. When you give them this full excursion, a longer runway of force production, it has to be quick still, because sport is time-based. Powerlifting isn't a time-based sport.
Right.
They can take however long they want to move that weight. And so for him, when you get the heel contact and you get that early propulsive position where his body weight's behind, and then he has a quick transfer through the max propulsive moment when he pushes off, and then now this late propulsive moment that is where he should be in this flight phase and really efficient in pushing off. He's able to get that now because of the initial foot position being in that early phase, rather than being late in the line of force production where a lot of athletes live at.
I see. And I've seen James Harden and Damian Lillard. I don't know if you watch a lot of their tape. They do this a lot, where it is also a part. It is a strategy to move quickly in the time constraint, but it's also a great strategy of being deceptive. So when you see with James Harden, when he kind of goes through the leg and he's dribbling and he's kind of lulling the person to sleep, it's very his center of mass is back and he's very into his heel, but he's reacting to the defender. And once he sees that opportunity, he's able to reposition that foot into a very late stage propulsive manner and kind of propel himself forward. And it's the same thing with Damian. It's a very good strategy in the sense that people think that you're decelling or slowing down, but by repositioning the foot, you're able to quickly propel yourself forward.
Right. It is such a timing emphasis, being able to have someone be comfortable with thinking that they're in front of you, and then to be able to blow by them really without a lot of effort on your case, because you've had them in a position that makes them vulnerable for something like that.
Yeah. And it's amazing that these players self-organize and do this intuitively.
Yeah.
Without ever having this conversation or even knowing about the terminology we use, which is what I think is amazing.
Because it works. And where my job becomes important is that the athletes that are not as good at doing stuff like that have never had success with a move like that. And they typically can't get into those positions to begin with. And so that's where creating, like James Harden, you and I can both agree, James Harden's not the fastest guy on the court. but he knows the timing of those positions and how to get through each one so well, that it makes him deceptively quick when the ball is in his hand. And he does a lot of other things that from a just being smarter than other players standpoint, like a basketball IQ standpoint, and understanding that the defender is being on defense is a reactionary position. You're not making any decisions on defense. You are reacting to positions that the offensive player is in.
Hmm.
So being able to use that to your advantage is really, really important as an offensive player. And so, yeah, that becomes having access to those positions in the first place. Again, it allows you a greater spectrum of options to move through. And so if you have those options, now you've got what the kids say, a bigger bag. You've got more tricks to work with.
Yeah, use the red backpack emoji now.
Right. You've got now these movement options that you didn't have before, and so that's where eliminating some of their compensatory biases is going to help them from an athletic and hopefully from an injury standpoint.
Yeah, and just to use the James Harden ish example, is that it's the threat of the step back, right? That is why you said like a defender reacts, and so they are thinking that at any point he's going to go to the step back, and they have to react quickly and propel themselves forward to contest that shot. So that opens up this opportunity to also accelerate past the defender, because they're always so eager to move forward and close space against him.
How is he covered ground on a step back?
By pressing back
off his heel.
Yeah.
You cannot press back. Like, you can't put a foot out in front of you and press back off of your mid and forefoot and have any space created there. Because typically to do that, you're going to have a positive shin angle, and you're going to end up pushing up into the air. So even for that step back to be created and to create as much space as he does, Gabe York on our team does. I mean, a lot of people know that name just based on like Ball is Life stuff. And he had a great career at Arizona. He does that better than anyone that I've seen in person. Like, he will create 5 or 6 feet of space by pushing off of his right foot so hard and so efficiently through his heel that there's so much space there, and it's so quick. And he's got a quick release anyway, so it gives him all this time for a shot. And defenders, you can tell now that we're at this point in the season, they're worried about that type of thing. Like, the way that they guard him is different than it was at the beginning of the season. So now he finishes at the rim way more than he did when he was shooting, a high percentage at 3 at the beginning of the season.
The most entertaining clips are watching Klay Thompson and Steph Curry just walk to the basket, because everyone, if they just raise their eyebrows, everyone is moving forward and they're just going right past them to the rim. And I would argue, I guess, if you do get into the forefoot, because there are situations where you've overextended yourself, say like you've decided to go for the drive and you've transitioned from your heel to the forefoot, that at that point, and you realize that maybe you don't actually have the space, or the defender reacted appropriately and it's no longer there. Well, like you said, you can't press back. Then you might go into a sidestep or press laterally, reposition the back foot, and then accelerate forward again, right? So the player who has more movement variability or options is able to kind of problem solve. And that's a very cool and unique thing to see live on the court.
Yeah, especially at the speed that they do it. It's really, really, that's where you have a greater appreciation, or at least I do now, of being in this environment and seeing how what they've done in their skill work and their development work has translated into on the court in terms of decision making. Because it is, you do have those players that is so natural for them to upshift and downshift gears and to be able to change levels as efficiently as they do. And to, really, like, we've got some guys that change speed like crazy. And it's not just, their actual foot speed. It's the speed that they dribble with, the height that they dribble at. And it's crazy to watch.
Yeah. And it would be very interesting. Like, they're the players that you observed that you described as such good movers and are able to self-organize to solve whatever problems in front of them. But in the next decade or so, it would be fascinating to see, as we break down, maybe reverse engineer that pattern or movements or those qualities, how can we, one, give them, obviously like genetics plays a huge role, but the ones that do have the genetics, how do we give them access to maybe that force production, range of motion? Like you said, it depends on their archetype or whatnot. But then there's the component that you just mentioned, which is they're so fast with the ball. And that is a skills component, right? You can train and give the guy all the adaptations, but if the ball isn't coming with him because he can't dribble or do the move at the newfound speed that he had, well, guess what? Like you said, in a game, people always default to their strengths and what they're good at. No one's thinking, hey, let me try this new move and turn the ball over when I'm trying to fight for this contract. They're going to go with what they know. But then you have the component of, okay, now I have the new said range of motion or qualities that allow me to do that. Now, the skill development coach has to understand the component of skill acquisition and how do I make this new skill with the ball stick, and then not only stick through the skill workout, but how do we get it to stick where it's performing it against the highest form of competition? And that's what's really exciting to me, is how can, as we advance in this field, how can we marry the information and consolidate it for the athletes who we already have such little time with?
Right. Yeah, I think that's a really, really good point. I think that more often than not, I see myself again as having the most amount of influence in player availability, and that being kind of the first and foremost thing that's important in my mind. And those changes, I think that's because I can probably see how those landing mechanics and things without the ball, and just how they're able to kind of naturally make changes in those things based on the training that we're doing. I see those changes, and you can read them on a force plate, and you can do all this stuff. And so there's feedback that I get in terms of the effectiveness of the training that I've done in those qualities. What becomes harder is how does this actually help them, like you said, with the ball in their hand, or how does this help them when they are reactionary to an offensive player in terms of, getting their hips reoriented, being able to plant at an efficient angle to push off of most efficiently. And so those are kind of like mama bird moments for me, because I'm like, here, like I've given you what I can give you from this standpoint. This is where they take it now. And then hopefully it's something that like you said, that sticks quickly with them.
And only you will recognize that moment, which is glorious, but also I guess it goes to why you do it, right? But
Yeah.
only you in that split second recognize, oh wow, he did it.
Yeah.
And it looked good.
Yeah.
And he might not even notice it himself. And
Right.
those are kind of the moments that, keep you going.
Right.
And
I'm fortunate in this environment to have guys that ask a lot of really good questions about why we do stuff. I think mostly those questions stem out of the fact that I'm asking them to do things that nobody else in my position with them has asked them to do before. Because the training that we do compared to what I think that they traditionally get at the college level or with another professional team is different.
mm-hmm,
And I know that based on feedback that I've got from them.
mm-hmm.
Um, but because it is so specific to them as an individual, because they can see that other people in the room are not doing the same stuff that they're doing or not doing it the same way that they're doing, they ask questions about that stuff
And
and
they're bought
how
in.
how it applies to them. And so then you're able to have that conversation about this works on this and this and this. And then I get feedback about, man, I felt my foot on the ground like that, or I felt, the pain symptom management is easy, right? They can feel when their knees feel better. They can feel when their ankles feel better. But when they're able to, consciously recognize that they made a difference on the court, that's really, really rewarding and really, really cool at this level. So
Definitely. Can you, for my own edification, provide some examples of those things that you would say are so unique to what you do in the weight room that people are like, hey, that's kind of funky,
yeah,
or I've never seen that before?
I I think that what sets me apart in general from most strength coaches is my like how I control the variables of training for them. So um, obviously everybody knows that you can control load and you can control tempo and you can control like the device that you use to implement those things. Like everybody
Mhm.
knows what a barbell is, and for some people it's great, for some people it's not. I find that generally in my population the barbell from even a mental standpoint is not their best friend because they associate it with things that are uncomfortable for them.
Yeah.
But for me, load placement's a big deal. So the split squat example is really easy for people to see, but a goblet position split squat is going to shift my center of mass back. So if I need for someone to be in a more early propulsive position, so a very vertical shin angle, weight typically towards the back of their foot, a goblet squat does that for me because the load is anterior and it helps them to push volume posterior in their thorax.
Mhm.
If I was to have that kettlebell hang in the arm on their forward leg side, so a ipsilateral load,
So, yeah.
that is going to, in general, turn them out of that front hip. So if I've got someone that is limited in IR on the front side, I'm not going to drive them further into IR by having the load be contralateral and it turning them towards the front knee. It's actually
Mhm.
going to turn their thorax away from the front knee, so it biases an ER position. Like I just said, the inverse of that is that contralateral load that on the back leg side that's going to turn them into their forward hip. And this varies based on where you're at in terms of depth of the movement, but then you control things like depth. So if I have someone who doesn't have 90 degrees of hip flexion on whatever leg is forward, they're not going down to 90 degrees. I've got it limited with Erik's pads, or I've got a box there that's going to limit their depth. um, Breathing we talked about earlier, so how you coach breathing in an exercise is going to help influence certain movements. And so an inhale is obviously an expansive quality of your thorax and your body in general. So having them do an inhale on the way down for someone who needs help descending their pelvic diaphragm, or need help being able to achieve depth in a position, needs an inhale probably on the descent of that. Where someone who needs help controlling how far they go, so again, that low force output person who doesn't necessarily manage gravity and forces well, they might need an exhale on the way down to be able to limit how far they go rather than achieve some new depth. um, Obviously, like a front foot elevation is going to shift your body weight back even further. A rear foot elevation is going to pitch you into a more middle or late propulsive position. So that's a handful of things just with a split squat that you can do to. I have some guys who only do split squats with one leg forward at this point in the season because I know what pattern they get into. And if I've got an issue or something that for me is a red flag on that one side, I'm going to address that through how we do a split squat.
Mhm.
And so I think when you have, maybe it's not the exercises themselves. I do have them do some stuff that I know that they haven't done before. Like there's rolling stuff on the floor that I think, promotes this force absorption stuff, with guys who are afraid to be on the ground anyways, or afraid to fall.
The egg roll.
I know, yeah, the egg roll stuff. Like I know they haven't done that before. So that's why that stuff is fun to work on. But even the way that an exercise is coached for them as an individual is nuanced for them. So they have questions about, why am I doing it like this when so and so is doing it like that? So even though the themes of an exercise might be the same across a group, the group that's in the weight room at that time, the execution for each one is different. The
Mhm.
tempos for each one is different. Some might need control on the way down and speed on the way up. Some might need control through the entire range of motion. Some might need that drop and catch element where they're beating the weight down. They're able to put a stop on it at the bottom and then turn it around on the way up. So you can do a lot of things if you have a reason for the exercise. You can start to dial in how specific you get with the needs on that, and then just see, some guys, the level of constraint that I provide, I get pushed back on, and then I decide, okay, look, if it's too many things for you to think about during the exercise, these are what I think are going to be the biggest rocks that we're going to cover to achieve the goal of the exercise. But there are some guys who want as much constraint provided for me as possible. And I don't
Right.
say a lot during the exercise. Like there's not a lot. If I've set it up in the way that I want it set up, and I think that they're doing an above average job at it, there's not a lot of feedback I need to give them.
Right. You want it to become instinctual for them and not
Yeah.
overcoach and not have them think about 9 different cues while
Yeah.
they're doing the exercise.
Yeah.
Oh, that makes a
There
lot of
should be
sense.
some intrinsic, there should be some intrinsic sensation that's involved in that exercise for them. And then this is a different tangent, but like having them have that autonomy, then that if they get in a situation where I'm not available or I'm hung up in something else, I remember this exercise and the way that I set it up here felt good. And it helps me, this day doing this exercise or doing this drill. So like, I'm going to go do this on my own. I'm going to incorporate this as part of my warm up. I have autonomy in what I do now. And you give them some decision making because you've set up the constraints and the parameters of the exercise so specifically for the result on their end.
Yeah, that's really amazing. And I can definitely see there's only people who, well, I don't want to say only people who come out of IFAST do those things. I'm assuming there's a lot of other trainers that have different constraints, but at least in the realm of college players coming to you, like they probably do not have a lot of exposure to that much nuance just because in the collegiate environment, it's, you got one strength coach to 15, 20 guys in the room who can't give the same individualized attention that maybe you are able to give to a G League player, an NBA guy.
Right.
Just to pivot to kind of more personally for you, how can you maybe share some experiences where you've learned from maybe other sports or other disciplines that have been applicable or helpful in regards to basketball?
Yeah, it's a really good question. Because I don't think that I think even that in the position that I'm at now, working with only basketball players, it's still for me, um, it's still for me not a basketball only job because so many of the movements that they're asked to do and so many of the demands in terms of what they do on the court is not that much different than other sports. I worked with a lot of volleyball players when I was in the private sector at IFAST, and there are definitely the shapes of the individuals that I'm working with are much different. Obviously, female athletes in general have a bigger bias towards force acceptance and a lower threshold of force output than male counterparts of the same size. And so I have to treat those two things with that lens kind of involved. But um, I think you find really quickly when you move into working with only one sport what works and what doesn't work.
Hmm.
And so you start to really trim the fat off of things that you used to, like there are much fewer exercises that I do than I used to do when I was working with a wider variety of people because I found that and maybe some of that was the time constraint. Like, now if I get 20 minutes a day with somebody, it's a really big deal. And before I was getting an hour 15 with somebody, and that was kind of what was minimally acceptable for them. Um, and so you learn what's going to make the biggest change in terms of achieving our goal with this person in this amount of time. And so you become more, um, I'm much more compound in the way that I prescribe an exercise in terms of before I might have an entire workout like we talked about those layers of athletic development. Like I might have an entire workout for someone who's new and really needs to learn how to accept force. I might have an entire workout that's geared towards that. I don't have that luxury at this level. So that has to be layered in with everything else that I do. So now, their exercises are an overwhelming bias towards accepting force with understanding that that needs to tie into their force output because they're going to leave my weight room and go out on the practice court immediately and have to be able to produce force.
Right.
So how do I balance that? Um, how creatively can we get when the layout of our stuff is treatment, weight room, ramp them up for practice, have a practice, ramp them back down, and get them ready to go home at the end of the day. Um, that's not unique to basketball. That exists in a lot of sports. But before, I was the main focus in that in the private sector. I got them in a better position with a reset exercise, ramped them up to the most important adaptational point of our workout, and then cooled them back down myself. And that was their day. There was no, I've got an hour and a half practice now. I've got to be on and I've got to be playing basketball at a high level. There was none of that involved in that off-season training, because there may be getting shots up, but that's not output driven. That's not totally max effort force production that they're living in.
Right.
So I think that the biggest thing is just learning how each guy is going to respond to practice, and you get in rhythms with that stuff too. And then they are very ritualistic in the things that they do. So how do I implement change in some of that stuff? Like, there are guys that I have that have been doing the same warm up for 5 years because that's what they knew. And maybe some of them played overseas where they didn't have access to someone like me. So they had to learn how to do things on their own. And so how do I make small, meaningful changes in that I think are going to help them achieve their goals? And how do I still let them feel like mentally they're doing the things that they need to be doing? I don't necessarily agree with static stretching, but do I allow some people to do it? Yeah. Do I statically stretch people pregame? Yes. It might not be something that I totally agree with, but I have to let them do that. So I think, to answer your question in a really, really long roundabout way, basketball is so unique. And so I don't think that I can be, basketball is unique from a cultural standpoint. It's not necessarily unique from a movement standpoint. And so the themes that I've had throughout my entire training career are, we need to have this global focus of accepting force and creating force and creating force quickly and creating force quickly repeatedly. My methods of getting that done have changed because now the constraints have changed for me in terms of my schedule. The tools have changed because now I have a beautiful weight room and I have this unlimited budget to do all this stuff. And I have tech that I've never had before telling me that we're making progress or we're not making progress. I have immediate feedback from them on the court. Guys have bad days. Like that, like it would be such a
No, you have to stick to the program.
right. It would be such a different experience if before I had 4 weeks of training laid out, and now I am very reactionary to the schedule that we have. I am very reactionary to the practice schedule that gets printed out, and how we manage high stress days and how we manage low stress days and off days. That stuff all has to be dialed in on my end, and they just have to show up and do what's asked of them. And I need to be accommodating of their personality or what they're going through that day. And so it's really hard to take stuff from other sport and understand just how constrained the schedule and their attention span is, and what I'm asking them to do, and try to be really efficient. So if anything, I've become much more dialed in on what my values are here and how I achieve the things that I think are important in terms of athletic development.
No, that's a great response. How do you continue to push your own ability to learn now, though? Because in the professional setting, the stakes are a lot higher.
I think that that's easier than most people would give credit for at this level, just because there is a new and different problem every day. There is something that, from a performance standpoint, is an issue every single day that is new, or that I haven't had to deal with before. And so I don't have any qualms about trying things out. I think that if it's done in a safe to fail manner, so what? If I'm taking into considerations all of the pros and cons that I can imagine given the situation that I put them in, and then part of this is just knowing the athlete, right? Like, I'm at the point in the season where even though we've had a lot of guys come through the door here, the core group of guys that are here I know pretty well.
Hmm.
I know what they're receptive to. I know what they're not receptive to. I know how nuanced I can get with something with each individual before they tend to push back on it or shut down from an attention standpoint. I know what the travel schedule looks like on their energy level or their personality at this point in the season. So there are some guys that I know are going to be more receptive to me experimenting with them, and there are some guys that I know I need to be in a pretty standard routine with them to, and maybe some nuances sprinkled in, but I need to be able to be consistent for them.
Right.
So yeah, it's not quite as difficult as what I think people would imagine. There are just so many interesting challenges that arise every day in terms of who's got symptoms with what, and what are they experiencing, and then here's what I had in mind for today, but this is where we're going to have to pivot with this because of how they look, or here's a change in the practice schedule, or here's a new player that we added this morning because we had somebody go down. So that's just that for me is the continuing education at this point. It's I take really good notes. I write in a journal every day about what we've done. Obviously I keep track of the workouts that we're doing and all that stuff, so that's there for reference, but I'm able to take a step back at the end of the day and digest what has happened and what was successful and what was not successful. I ask my players for a lot of feedback, so I think they feel like they can be honest with me. I'm a very low stakes decision maker in this organization, right? Like I'm not controlling their playing time.
Right.
I'm not able to hold them out of games or do anything like that. So they can be honest with me about things, and that feedback helps. Um, you know, I've had recently, I mentioned like more data, more access to technology and more access to data and stuff like that. That for me, more than anything, has reinforced a lot of the beliefs that I already had and a lot of the strategies that I already had in terms of what is I don't want to say table measures aren't objective, but they're so individualized based on who takes them, and they're so individualized based on what you're looking for. When you have subjective data to reinforce the things that you have always kind of known or assumed to have known in this field, it's really interesting to have that stuff backed up. And then
Hmm.
again, like I said, you're cutting the fat. There are things that I've tried here that I've not been happy with the results on, or that I've not been happy with from a resource standpoint, how long it took me to explain the way that guys were, the way that guys accepted it or didn't accept it in the weight room, all this stuff. And so you
What was
learn
that
from,
biggest piece of fat that you've trimmed? One, the biggest, the
oh,
largest,
geez.
the bacon.
Yeah, there are guys that over coaching an exercise is the largest thing in general that I have trimmed back on. So I think before I would not necessarily say too much to them to get them set up for an exercise, but I know now how much rope I have to explain something new. If the exercise for me takes too long to set up, or it is or there's too many constraints involved in it, or there's too many cues that I have to give before they even get in the exercise, it's done, right? So simplifying things and being able to dial back is the biggest thing that I've trimmed away at. So a lot of the things that if you look at my Instagram like 2 years ago that I thought, again, I don't think that I was at that time even coming up with stuff that was like just wildly different than the rest of the industry.
Hmm.
I was putting my twist on positions or exercises that already existed that I thought were pretty easy to manipulate in terms of achieving an output at a high level. I have to sacrifice some of that output now in order to have compliance with what I'm asking them to do. That's difficult for me because I am kind of a control freak or perfectionist in what I do from a training standpoint, because I like to have as much, I want the greatest amount of result. So I like to have the greatest amount of control over how they do something or what I'm asking them to do. Now I understand that for them to keep coming back and seeing me, and for them to keep, like, they have a choice at this level. That's the reality of this. They have a choice to see me or not. or they have a choice to do something or not. It's their body, it's their career. Um, I have, at the end of the day, their best interest in mind, I think, from my perspective. So how do I set something up for them to get what I think is the primary need out of the exercise that's going to take the least amount of their mental energy to perform?
That
So it's not
you're already dealing with lower attention spans as well. So
right, and it's not
you
just
having
one
to
thing.
explain those things.
I wish I could give you one thing, like, yeah, I really cut out the breathing aspect of this. But for some guys, they love having things tempoed by breathing. So I still do that with a handful of guys. There are
Yeah.
guys that I know are not going, or the weight room is not their best friend and they're not that invested in it. So I ask less of them to do those certain things, because I understand that for me to get any result from them, I'm going to have to accommodate to what their level of care for what this is.
More than anything, the art of coaching comes to the forefront when you're doing professional sports. One, because
Huge.
of attention span. Two, you're probably their fifth strength coach at this time,
Yeah.
or seventh, and
Yeah.
they might have their own guy.
Yeah.
So they might be, like you said, some overseas players might have their own routine that's worked for them for the last decade, and now you want to tell them to inhale, and they're like, no.
Yeah. Yeah, they don't care. Some of them don't care. And some of them do, and those guys are really, really enjoyable to work with, because they care about all the little things that I nerd out on in an exercise, or
Yeah.
that I put thought into. Because at the end of the day, like, I want them to know that I have put a ton of thought and emphasis on the exercise that I ask them to do. So it's hard for me to back off that and say, I'm just going to have this be what you need now by me being less involved in it. So it's an
Yeah.
ego adjustment for me. And yeah, it's one of those things that I think you have to be consistent across the board with the guys that you work with, because I am essentially a cartoon character to them. They see me every day and I'm supposed to have the same attitude. I'm dressed
Same
almost
energy.
the same energy. And yeah, so they have an expectation of me to be consistent for them. And I enjoy that aspect of it. And I enjoy trying to meet them where they're at and try to help them with their career.
Yeah, I can imagine how hard your job is and the adjustment that you've had to make this, this past year and this past season. I have two just short questions for you. Well, the first one might be a little bit longer, but I'll try to keep it brief. You have access to, are you guys using Connexon, or what are you guys using
Yeah, we
for
have to
time motion? So I guess using Connexon, and then I know you categorize your players by a player who's playing starter minutes, over 32 minutes, and then you have, your 0 to 16 and 16 to 32. For the guys who are in the 0 to 32 who are not playing that much, how are you, I guess, keeping them in shape from a energy systems perspective? Like, what are you doing? Obviously, most people would say, well, they just need to play the sport more. So whether they're doing more scrimmaging or more 3-on-3 or small sided games, I guess outside of that, what are you doing to make sure those guys, when they step onto the court, are ready to meet the demands if they have to?
Right. Well, to start off, you hit the nail on the head with organizing short-sided games. That is the biggest part of this, in my opinion, in terms of keeping players in shape. Obviously, we have um, having a G League team in town is important for a lot of we can assign players that are low level minutes with the Pacers to a G League team that they play with, and then they end up playing starter minutes. So you have a built-in system that allows them to do that. That doesn't require them playing with you have guys that you could potentially play them with after a practice that are not in the same minutes group that they are, or not in the same position group that they are, and so it ends up not being all that beneficial.
Mm-hmm.
So assigning players is a huge deal, and using that resource as a G League team to have players stay in shape or at least recondition. Outside of that, a big thing that we've implemented since our season has picked up quite a bit. So at the beginning of the season with the G League schedule, we would play back-to-backs on like a Friday, and then we'd have the entire week off,
Mm-hmm.
and then play another back-to-back. So it was this really weird schedule of
Like
it was
football
supposed to be,
players.
yeah, it was a football schedule. So we had all this practice time, and players were really, really well conditioned during that practice time. That time doesn't exist anymore. There is no practice at this point. And so what you're looking at is post-game lifts for the most point, which I thought was going to be this pulling teeth situation with the players to get them to come in. They understand now with the way that the schedule works that if we've got a day off between games, that day off needs to be a day off. So what we end up doing, regardless of their minutes played, is a post-game lift that allows, and now obviously it is categorized by minutes played.
A super high minute guy, you might consider not doing a post game lift, but you're keeping the high days high basically.
I might, yeah, but the majority of them, honestly, at this, if they play 40 minutes, I think I have 4 guys that the other night played 40, and we still lifted after the game because that's still an opportunity for me to keep a high day high. The struggle with the low minute guys is that playing time around the corner could be high. I have no way of predicting the fact that that won't be high at some point. It could be high the next game. And so how we organize our post-game lifts is a lot more volume. There's a lot more output in terms of load driven. So I have less of a concern with maybe the speed that things are happening, and more of a concern with how much time are they spending under tension and how much just pure output am I putting their tissues under. They do a lot more sprinting after a game. So I have kind of built into our speed agility stuff. I have ways that we build up sprint starts. I have ways, I want their time in high acceleration, high like phase acceleration to be matched up to about what a starter minutes would get. So maybe that's 5 high output sprints in a game down the court is enough for me to cover that ground and make those two things between the non-starters and starters a little bit more equal. And so it really does, the Connexon stuff has been helpful in the second spectrum and sport view and all that stuff, because it's given us harder parameters to live by with what a starter actually goes through on the court.
Mm-hmm.
And it gives us the minimums that we need, like the lowest effective dose of things that we need to be able to meet that demand if the time is like when the time comes.
Is there any multi-directional stuff, or is it just like, because that, like you said, the minimum doses he's going to get 5, he might not reach max speed, but we're going to have him sprint as hard as he can, 5 up and downs. Are you doing other stuff like lateral stuff?
Stuff.
Okay.
There's a ton of multi-directional. Yeah. So how I build them up in a sprint, I will usually start them out doing some kind of change of direction move, whatever that is for that day, and building that into a sprint. Because traditionally those things, I understand for the teaching concept, like having them do a bunch of hip turns in a row or having them do a bunch of like shuffle steps in a row is good at a baseline of teaching them what this movement should feel like. That's rarely how that occurs in sport. Like if you're shuffling more than 2 times in a row,
he's gone.
Yeah. So that
you get one shuffle.
Right. That shuffle has to turn into a side runner, has to turn into a hip turn, or has to turn into something else. So I build it up like that. And that way, again, if I've got 20 minutes after a game, I better be as dialed in and as compound and concise as I can be with everything that I'm asking them to do. So that's the way that our speed and agility stuff works out too. It's very little point in me running somebody on a treadmill and using 15 minutes of my 20 minutes on something like that, when I could get a lot of bang for your buck in building an ISO position that drive a sensation that has load on it, and then adding some momentum to something that's a similar position, but having it be rhythmic, and then using that and turning it into something that's either reactive or multi-directional in terms of an output. So yeah, that's the way I typically scale things, is they'll have an A exercise, B exercise, C exercise. A exercise is going to be the simplest, dulled down form of what we're going to hopefully get in the reactive exercise, that's that C exercise.
No, that's I love how you think about that. And that's definitely being with the pro team, it teaches you how to be as economical and efficient with your time. Otherwise,
Yeah,
you won't be there very long.
sure. For
The last question is with the Pacers, what's an area where you feel like you can learn a lot more that would make a big impact?
I think from a career standpoint and also from a direction that the league is heading in, being multifaceted is kind of a big deal. Like, although we do have very individualized columns of resources for the players, like everybody, when you get into a large performance staff or a large support staff for a team, everybody kind of has their lane because you're supposed to be an expert in X, Y, or Z. Um, at the same time, organizations like to save money on
Yep. I
support
was
staff,
about to
and so
say
they like you to be, they like
three
you to
hats.
be, yeah, right. They like you to be kind of multifaceted, and that also helps with your ability to speak between these groups of people. I think for a career standpoint, that really leads me in two directions. You can either go towards this physical therapist, strength coach route, which is very typically rehab oriented or reconditioning oriented, which is the background that I come from.
Mhm.
I'm really comfortable in that environment. I think that compared to other strength coaches at this level, I speak on the medical side at a much higher level, and I'm able to cross that border much easier because I can say all of those things and see all of those things, and I can measure all of those things. Um, I think the pathway that that leads to for me in terms of continuing development is how to bridge the gap between the biomechanic aspect, the sports medicine position movement quality aspect, and the data aspect, because the data is becoming such a big piece of what we do now. Being able just to operate kind of that technology is not enough at this point. It's being able to have it be useful to the other support staff members, being able to write reports and being able to kind of disseminate what is useful and what is not useful information for each individual, developing KPIs, being able to cross that border between the health, performance, and basketball side of things is going to be really, really important, because we obviously have all the video and data side for what we do from a sports standpoint, that's being combined with all the movement and load management data and stuff that we have on the performance side, and then how are those two things effectively making change. I think that's really hard to do both things well. I think that there are not many people that are in that hybrid role that understand movement and understand what the effects of training are at a really high level, and also understand the data side of things at a
Or
really,
analytics, or studying
yeah,
stats their whole life.
right, right. It's because if you have conversations, if you're in this long enough, you have conversations with people who are on both sides of that fence. Whatever side of the fence they are on is the answer. It is what is going to be effective in making change. And the reality of that is it's probably the gray area in between those two things that are going to make the most change.
Yeah.
So that's what I'm looking for. That's why this job, like, I wasn't unhappy in my last job. I wasn't unfulfilled. I really did enjoy being in the private sector and being able to kind of have this wide variety of things. What I felt like was the motivation for making the jump like this was new challenges and new experiences and new access to things that I haven't had before. Because I think when you get stagnant in terms of your ability to make change, the job becomes less fulfilling. Like, I think that there are so many things and so much room for improvement with where I'm at right now. It's fun. Like, it's like I said, the problem solving aspect of this is what makes this job really, really fun, in terms of the people that you work with, and like for some people, I can see how having as many constraints as a team setting have is being really frustrating, because you don't feel like you're able to make change. And I feel like that is part of what makes it so difficult to affect change. But it is also part of what makes this really fun, is finding the problem solving and finding the solution for things that have been issues for people. Because I think one of the reasons they brought me in here was because I didn't see things the same way that the other coaches that they've had in this position have seen things.
Yeah, and
Maybe that's just
you don't want the echo chamber. Like you welcome that different mental model or perspective that's always challenging whether your current explanation is the right or best explanation, right?
exactly
Because we can we can explain something or have a reason or have data, and the guy can say, well, that's great, my knee still hurts. And you can be
exactly
like, oh, well, the tendon research says this, and we're supposed to give you this protocol, and based on the literature, blah, blah, blah. And it's like, I understand, but my knee still hurts.
yeah.
So, and that's where you have to reconcile, okay, well, there's something clearly wrong with this model or explanation I have for this pain. So I would love a different perspective or someone who thinks differently or comes from
Right.
a different school of thought. And I think that is so important in organizing. And it does sound like at the Pacers, you guys have a very diverse team, as well as at iFast. Just the diversity of backgrounds and way people think, whether it's Bill or Mike or the other individuals there. I'm not familiar with the other people, but from what you shared, it sounded like you were able to really constantly challenge your own mental model and expand. And what's so exciting about your current opportunity is you every day are iterating. You're not having to wait 6 months, a year, whatnot. You're iterating at the highest level. And you can only deduce, like, if it works for these guys who have a training age of 15 years, like, I can handle someone who's, 2 years into training. Like,
Right.
these problems are a lot easier for me. So
Right.
that's very cool. I guess, where can people find you?
Yeah. So I'm really only active on Instagram, and I'm not even that active these days. So
You
it
were.
I wasn't. It might be a boring follow, but so eph.24 is my Instagram. Outside of that, I guess yeah, I have a personal email account that if anybody has questions, they can always reach out to. I don't check that as frequently anymore. Obviously, I get 50 work emails a day on my other account. So if you do have a question, I recommend either emailing me at Erik ErikHudd at gmail.com, or if you follow me on Instagram, just direct message me on there. That's typically the easiest way to get an answer out of me
Yeah, I'm
nowadays.
just gonna encourage everybody to just follow you on Instagram just to boost your following.
I appreciate that. I appreciate that.
um, if you had to recommend someone to interview or talk to, or someone you look up to in the realm of basketball, who would you recommend or suggest I talk to next?
Ty Terrell with the Atlanta Hawks. So Ty actually held my position at iFast before I took that over.
Mhm.
And he was, my basic, it still is a mentor as I made this transition, especially because he's been here, um, and was a mentor kind of from my sophomore year of college up into my professional years. So Ty has a much more succinct view of performance than I do. And so we are very, I would say we agree more often than we disagree about things, but he is so maybe he's just more experienced in terms of how he puts it in words, but it is like, I think it would be really worth your while to interview him. He doesn't put out a ton of content on stuff, so it'd be hard to like find things, but
Yeah.
um, he does a really good job in explaining his thought process and really simplifying things. He spent a long time with Lee Taft. Lee is like one of the best people I know at being able to take a complex movement or complex situation and be able to dilute it. And Ty does a really good job of that also. So
The OGs,
yeah, seriously.
as the kids would say.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, I really appreciate. I know how rare days off are for you, and to spend 2 hours doing an interview with someone you haven't met in person speaks volume to how big of a nerd you are, or how kind of a person you are to do this
It's
interview.
more on the
So
nerd side for sure. I appreciate that though. This is stuff is always really fun, and kudos to you. Like what a fantastic conversation to have, because a lot of times when you do something like this, it's just question, answer, next question, answer. And I can tell you put a lot of thought into your responses, and a lot of thought into your questions. And I feel like I learned a lot from this too, because I don't often at this point in my career have to put a lot of the stuff that I do into words. For this audience, at least, I have
Right.
to make a lot of things applicable to basketball, and for basketball players. So this is fun to do. I appreciate the opportunity.